Well, good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone's doing well. My name is Justin Peter. I'm Director of Quest Nature Tours, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to our webinar on discovering the Galapagos. I think our webinar will last about 45 minutes. And in today's presentation, I hope to give you some background on the Galapagos, maybe get you thinking a little bit more about it as a potential travel destination in the future, in 2021 or onwards, give you a sense of what to expect in the Galapagos in terms of sort of how to get there and what travel is like there, but as well as in addition to what are the things we're looking at there, and what is the experience of being in the Galapagos like. And we will, of course, we will be taking questions. There's a little question box, you'll notice, in your little webinar console. So if you have any questions at the end, I'll be happy to answer them. And I'm hoping that you're not discovering or having any audio issues with this. We will be recording this webinar as well, and you will be provided with the webinar recording link afterwards. So you can watch this webinar again. You can also forward that link to your friends in case maybe you want to travel together or you think they should see this as well. So thank you once again. And I'm really glad to be talking about the Galapagos because they are definitely one of my favorite destinations. I've been very fortunate to go to the Galapagos 3 times. And really, honestly, I'm looking forward to going again because it doesn't really get old or repetitive for very many reasons. I don't think I need to introduce the Galapagos in sort of the grand sense. I'm sure you're all acquainted with it, and some of what makes it special. I think we can certainly credit Charles Darwin for more than any other person for bringing the Galapagos to our attention. This is, of course, a younger Charles Darwin that you're looking at here in his 30s when he visited the Galapagos. He was not an elderly gentleman with a long white beard at the time. That was really much 30 years later or so. But he visited the Galapagos in 1835 for just 5 weeks. But that was enough to inspire him to include what he saw, the observations that he saw in the Galapagos in his great Origin of Species. And of course, evolution really has sort of, I mean, it's a theme that runs across, quite deeply now. It's something we're obviously very familiar with in terms of a concept, and that has sort of trickled down to all parts of popular culture. And in fact, you may have read this book, The Beak of the Finch, which is based on research on the Darwin's finches in the Galapagos. And if you have not read this book, you ought to. All of that to say, and these of course are the Darwin's finches, or a few of them, that we're all kind of aware of the Galapagos as a laboratory of evolution. It's a place that inspired Darwin, of course. It's not that evolution or natural selection only happens here, but it was a place, and it is a place where the functions are maybe more obvious than they would be elsewhere. The Galapagos, of course, are a set of islands. They are a set of about 15 or so islands. There are larger islands, there are smaller islands. And these islands, you might see the inset here. They're about, in fact, 1,000 kilometers off the west coast of South America. They technically belong to Ecuador. When Darwin was here, they were really kind of a no man's land. But there's larger islands, smaller islands, and there's sort of a core of them here in the middle, but there's some that are scattered out here in the upper left. And the area of the islands it's quite large. It's about the area of New England. If you were to put that on the map, superimpose, then they would be over quite a large area. And here they are, as you can see them. They are, in fact, directly on the equator. So the equator cuts through the islands right here. So they are certainly well within the tropics. They don't necessarily always feel tropical, and we'll talk a little bit more about how they look and how they feel later. But really interesting, and it might be possible to get to the islands by cruising, but that's not how you do that. Really, to get to the islands, you have to fly. So you will arrive in mainland Ecuador, and there's only 2 airports that you can use to get to the Galapagos, and they're both in mainland Ecuador, in Quito and in Guayaquil, which is a city in the south of Ecuador. So you fly to the Galapagos, and coming out of Quito, which is right in the Andes, you will come up above the clouds. You'll see volcanoes in the Andes, like this one, Cotopaxi, and eventually you'll head out over the Pacific, and you'll start to see, you'll get a glimpse of your first large island, and you'll land here on a nice small dry looking island. I'll say a very small island. You get off the plane here, and eventually you'll go through quarantine to make sure you're not carrying anything that should not be introduced to the islands. They're very strict about keeping the islands intact and pristine, ecologically speaking. And I'm not sure what you'd be thinking of the Galapagos, like what image you have of the landscape, but it's not really remarkable at first sight. It can look kind of scrubby and dry. Desiccated might be a word that would come to mind. Desolate. You can see the ocean around you here. But eventually we make our way to our vessel, and we've been using for a number of years the same vessel, which we like very much. Of course, you need a vessel to get from island to island because our itinerary includes several different islands, as I'll show you. This one is our favorite. It's called the Beluga, and the Beluga has 8 cabins. It's a really nice, small, cozy vessel. I'll show you a little bit about the inside here, because this would be our home for a week when we go to the Galapagos. So this is a little bit of the inside. Part of the dining area, so sort of a split area. That's half of us would sit at the other table, half of us would be this table here with the lounge. And it has a number of different cabins, 8 cabins, as I said, on the main deck, below the main deck, or above the main deck. And quite nice, cozy, clean, comfortable, everything you really need, I think, to have an enjoyable time. And this is a little tour of some of the different cabins. So some of them have 2 beds. You'll find a couple have one larger bed, queen size or double. And in some cases, we can actually take two separate beds and create a matrimonial bed. So the various options with portholes or with windows, and cozy on the inside, cozy on the outside as well. Great seating in the front, above on the upper deck, under a canopy, or at the rear deck here, you have beautiful sun lounging area if you want. And always a great place to be. Just generally a really nice, cozy place to travel, because this is really our floating hotel. It's meant to be comfortable. It's our home while we're not exploring the islands. And I think very quickly, I talked about the islands looking kind of desolate and dry when you get there initially, but you'll start to get a sense of what makes it special from the wildlife perspective. Not even talking about evolution, I'm just talking about wildlife in the impact, in the sense of impact, because you'll have wildlife literally at your feet, like this pup Galapagos sea lion, and you'll notice right away a lot of the wildlife has no apparent fear of people. A lot of the wildlife having evolved away from humans for such a long time just don't have a fear response. So you'll get that sense of novelty. It's not every day this type of thing happens. And you'll get a little bit of the drama happening around you as well, as we're waiting to get on our Zodiacs to get onto our vessel, the Beluga. You'll start to see bird life as well. This bird probably needs no introduction. If you look at its feet, you might get a sense of what its name might be. Diving right in front of us for fish and taking off, and those beautiful blue feet of the blue-footed booby. So it's exciting, it's novel, and there's stuff going on around us. So of course, this being a cruise, eventually once we're on the vessel, our crew will load all of our luggage onto the vessel and then into our cabins, and we'll get an orientation on board, introductions, and then we will set sail on our cruise. So of course, as I said, Galapagos, as you've seen, there are islands spread over such a large area. It is, from a practical standpoint, not possible to visit all the islands. Some of the islands are in fact off limits to cruising vessels. There are other ways of getting there. But really, in terms of time, expense, and providing a sense of the variety, we tend to concentrate in kind of one part of the archipelago or another. So, for example, we might concentrate on visiting islands falling roughly within the circle here. And that'll give us a sense of the sort of the similarities of the islands, but also very much the differences. And I'll point out some of those differences as we go through the presentation today. Of course, Darwin himself said, by far the most remarkable feature in the natural history of this archipelago is that the different islands, to a considerable extent, are inhabited by a different set of beings. And that sounds very interesting, and that's something you'll get the sense of. The itinerary sort of has a story, and we'll get to see things evolve, say that during the course of our week there. So, for example, this might be what the itinerary looks like in that area that I showed you circled in red. And so you'll start here where that green dot is, and over the course of that week, the movements are a bit exaggerated on this map just to make sure you see where we're going, where the lines are. But we'll have a number of different landings on different islands. Some small islands will have one landing, or some of the larger islands will have a couple of different landings. Generally, we're cruising overnight. We're making the larger crossings overnight to save time, and our day will involve a good density of experiences during daylight hours. And being right on the equator, daylight in the Galapagos is pretty much 12 hours dark, 12 hours light. So it's a fairly quick day, and it's action-packed. And to get onto the islands themselves, to our landings, we'll get into the zodiacs, which are called the pangas, P-A-N-G-A, in the Galapagos. And 6 of us, let's say, 6 or 7 of us will be on each. There's 2 zodiacs per vessel. And to get on the islands, we'll do what's called either a dry landing, which is where the zodiac will pull up to the island, and there might be a set of steps that have been constructed for us, and we step out onto those steps and then onto a trail. Or we'll also have the opposite, which is a wet landing, which is where there's a sandy beach, and we will pull right up onto the beach with the zodiac, and generally we have to step into the water or potentially get our feet wet. So we go barefoot, and then we put our shoes on the island. Or if you're me, which is me right here, you'll wear amphibious footwear that will get wet, probably, but then it's also comfortable to just keep them on and go about your excursion. And all footwear, once it gets back on the vessel, once we bring it back, has to be washed and kept in a specific area and kind of in quarantine, so that we don't introduce any seeds or any kind of wildlife from one island to the next. So everything is sort of sanitized between landings, which is great. Once again, when you step out onto the land, we have wildlife kind of waiting for us. I don't want to say it's a welcoming committee, but certainly at the front of the welcoming committee at the fore would be these guys, the Sally Lightfoot crabs, which are beautiful. And they are timid, but they rely on their speed to keep away from any potential threat. And they're on the rocky areas, they can sort of cover all the rocky areas. They're bright, beautiful, make for great photo opportunities, and they're remarkably tenacious. Watch this one here, clinging onto the rock. A wave comes up and washes right over it fairly violently, and that crab is still there. You might not have gone to the Galapagos expecting the crabs would be special. Probably the next one is one of the species you would expect more, or you may be aware is more of a special particular species. This is the marine iguana, endemic to the Galapagos Island. There are several different subspecies, and they're there and they're unafraid, and we can just watch them. And so we have that kind of immediate novelty on at any landing site. Something will be different, something will be interesting. So of course we have the animals, but for those who are maybe more interested in, who have a particular interest in plants, you'll find plenty to interest you. They're very different sort of forms and adaptations. This is a salt-tolerant shrub growing by the beach, very thick, kind of leathery leaves. Everything is very different and sort of sensuous, I would say. And the Galapagos are popular. They definitely are a popular destination. Sometimes we get asked, like, how, are the Galapagos, are there too many visitors going there? Visitation in the Galapagos is stringently controlled by the Galapagos National Park Authority, which is an agency of the Ecuadorian government. And so they are, in fact, 97% of the land area of the archipelago is part of the Galapagos National Park, where there may be no sort of development or conversion of land or anything like that. So they're popular, but one thing that the national park does to manage this is that they manage the number and the timing of landings that can happen at any of these numerous landing sites throughout the island. So at any one time, when we come to this landing right here, for example, we generally expect to be the only people at that landing at that time. And so timings are managed. Every vessel gets a specific time to land, and they're not allowed to kind of come early or come late or linger beyond their time. We have a certain, maybe a 2-hour slot, for example, and we're there. So we can get the feeling that we're in wilderness, and that's really the idea here. So we get into this location, it feels, I mean, we see footprints there, people have been there, but otherwise it feels like it sort of belongs to ourselves. The other thing that we need to do, first of all, to make sure we're all doing what we're supposed to do and also behaving correctly in terms of park regulations, is we always have an approved Galapagos National Park guide who's with us. In fact, that person will be with us on the vessel through the entire expedition, and will be providing pretty in-depth knowledge and interpretation of the specific sites we're going to. So we always have that benefit. And so we'll be, that person will be leading or co-leading us along with your Quest Nature Tours leader as we go along our landings. And as I said, every landing is different and very interesting and very particular. In fact, it's possible there's some field guide books that will list out all the potential landings you could do. And so you can study them in advance if you know what your itinerary is. And we're happy to tell you that if that's something you'd like to know, if you join us in one of our expeditions. And so this one, for example, here with this nice hill in the background, it's called Dragon Hill. And Dragon Hill is, it's called Dragon Hill for a good reason. I'll show you in a moment. But it has this lagoon, and you come to this lagoon to see some wading birds. Often you'll get some things like shorebirds, which are overwintering from North America, spending the winter here in the Galapagos. But it's a place where you can often see these American flamingos. This is the Galapagos subspecies of the American flamingo. There's about 500 of them in the archipelago. And so you get a chance to see them up close. These birds elsewhere, the same species you can find in Colombia or in the Caribbean, they tend to be shy of people, but here they're fairly tolerant, so you get fairly good views. And you always get some surprises when you're in the Galapagos. This trail goes below that hill that I call Dragon Hill. There are Galapagos land iguanas which live on that hill, and they're supposed to only be on that hill, like literally only on that hill. They used to be across this whole island, Santa Cruz Island, but from human encroachment in the years prior, they became limited to that hill. We were walking this trail, and then suddenly there was this Galapagos land iguana quite far away below the hill. A fantastic view, and guess what? It has no apparent fear of us, so you can get close to it. You're not allowed to approach within 2 meters of the wildlife. It may approach you and infringe on your space, but you're not allowed to approach closer than 2 meters. But for a great view or a great photograph, I think 2 meters is more than adequate. And this is the type of setting you get, which is pretty fantastic. So as I mentioned, going from one island to the next, you're making those longer crossings, usually they're overnight. And really the fun part of that is that you don't always know. I mean, you can read ahead on what the site is going to be like the next morning, but you would never really know. You arrive at night, you'll anchor, and in the morning you just wake up and look out your window. It's like a totally different landscape and a totally different island. And that's what makes it really, really fun. And I showed you the vessel. You know, you can be out there before breakfast, having a coffee, enjoying just soaking up the surroundings. In this specific case, this is an island, a small island, 24 square kilometers, called Santa Fe. It has some wildlife which is endemic to the island, to that island, that are found only there. And you know, we'll discover that in depth when we do our landing. But you know, you could just soak in the views in the morning with your coffee or tea, and it's just fantastic. This particular island, I mean, Santa Fe is special. There are these prickly pear cacti that are found throughout the islands, but there are different species and subspecies on different islands. This particular island, this has a giant prickly pear of the Santa Fe subspecies, which is the largest of the prickly pears in the Galapagos. It's giant. I mean, the tree is huge, and you'll see that in a moment. When we make our landing, we have the chance to walk among them in this landscape on our fixed trail, which we're not kind of wandering off the trails. There is a fixed trail for every landing, and behold what's there. And you can see that's a fairly impressive cactus, probably one of the bigger ones you'll see. Unless you've been to Arizona, you've seen the water cactus. But these are pretty impressive, and as I said, very big. They don't keep their spines on them when they're at this size, on the this size of trunk, so you can actually hug them. But you get just a chance to soak in that environment. And what you start to see as well, fairly quickly, is the connections between the animals and the plant life. This island, as I said, Santa Fe, for example, has a land iguana, different than the one I just showed you like 2 minutes ago, which is the Galapagos land iguana. This is the Santa Fe land iguana, only found here, distinctive looking, and they hang out and they feed largely on products of the prickly pear cactus. What do I mean by that? Well, if you think of eating a cactus, you might think that you'd be eating something that's full of spines. This is a young prickly pear cactus. This iguana can't eat this young cactus, which is about 1 meter tall, which is heavily covered in spines. But when that cactus gets big, it'll flower, it'll fruit. Fruit will drop off, like this one here, it'll wait for those. And it'll also eat the pads of the mature cactus, which have very few spines. And if they fall off, literally these iguanas are waiting below those cacti just for pieces to fall, and in the meantime they just sit there and you can walk by them. And this particular one is a male, and with his tail, I would say, well, he was probably about that long. I'm not sure if you can see me fully here, but you know, 4 to 5 feet in length. Quite impressive individual, and right there. Now, the lowlands of the islands tend to be fairly dry. There is a rainy season and dry season, which I'll talk about a little bit more about later. But we have a chance also on this expedition to sort of experience the difference in altitude on the island. Fairly well-drained soils along the coasts. In a couple of instances, we have a chance to actually go into the highlands of the bigger islands. And up there, we'll find quite a different environment, not sort of cactus and spiny, kind of a sort of a desert look to it. It'll have more of this lush, almost rainforest-like feel. If you've been to the Pacific coast of British Columbia, where you have all these mosses, trees festooned with moss as well. If you go to the highlands of the larger islands, you get a very different feel like this. And you can sometimes have different inhabitants. Iguanas are fairly impressive, but there are some species that are maybe more emblematic for the Galapagos, and we always make sure that we see these. One of them, of course, is the giant tortoises of the Galapagos Islands, very famous. You don't really get a sense of scale maybe on this one here, but it's big, And these, like the iguanas, like much of the other wildlife, have no real apparent fear of humans. They can be jittery if you approach too quickly, which is why you keep a certain distance from them. If they're nervous, they may retreat into their shells like this. And there's a couple places where we can see them. One of them is a sort of a ranch, which is technically is outside of the Galapagos National Park area, because there were settlers on the islands and they created some small scale ranches. But these tortoises, which are native to this one spot here, they wander freely and wander about. And I said they were big, and I mean, they are big and generally oblivious to us if we just leave them alone. And really, I don't know if I think they're cute. Really, what I think doesn't really matter, but you do have a chance to contemplate the wildlife. All of it. I personally found that these remind me a little bit about of ET here. And giant tortoises, well, plenty of opportunity to see them, and they really literally rule the roost, because if there's a tortoise in the road, you have to wait for the tortoise to cross. What's really interesting about the tortoises, as with the other wildlife, much of the other wildlife we'll see, is that there's not just one Galapagos giant tortoise. There are several species of them, and you can find them on different islands. This is a map I was just looking at today. The islands with gray have tortoises on them. Some of them have two different species on one island. Some of them have 5 species. There's 16 species in total. 5 of them are extinct, unfortunately, but 11 of them survive. During the age of exploration, sailors would come to the Galapagos and they would actually collect giant tortoises, put them on their vessels in their holds. The tortoises could survive months without eating or drinking, and the tortoises could therefore be kind of kept alive and fresh and then eaten when the sailors were hungry. That includes whalers who were coming in and stationing in the Galapagos as well. And it's thought that hundreds of thousands of tortoises were taken from the islands. So some of them became critically endangered. However, their numbers are recovering of the surviving species. And we will have a chance not only see the large tortoises in the wild, the adults, but we'll visit the Charles Darwin Research Station, which is on the island of Santa Cruz here in the middle. And we'll actually see some of the restoration efforts taking place, which involves rearing tortoises that are segregated according to the species on the island. These tortoises will be raised here until they're large enough, and then will be repatriated to their island of origin and released. And some of these projects have been going on for a number of years and have been successful in reestablishing populations that were only survived because tortoises were in captivity in zoos around the world before they were brought back into this breeding program. So have a chance to see the wildlife. Now, one element that I think will surprise a lot of first-time visitors to the Galapagos is the richness of the underwater environment. The Galapagos are in an area of productive, or really a productive marine environment. The national park actually extends out to sea. It's not just the land. So there's a large area of the oceanic environment which is protected. But just because of the currents that feed the Galapagos, that feed into the Galapagos, it's a productive marine environment. And how do we discover that? Well, we have a chance. You don't have to, but you have a chance to discover that by regular snorkeling or swimming excursions. And these are excursions that happen very conveniently, usually before lunch. So they're after a morning excursion and before lunch and before an afternoon excursion. And so they're optional. They don't interfere with any of our land excursions, but there's a time slot dedicated to them. And even if you've never snorkeled before, it's a fantastic place to try. And when you go, I think you will not regret it, because it's just what you will see will, I think, astonish you. Variety of different fish, yellow-tailed surgeonfish. What I love about the learning fish is that they don't have simply 1 or 2 word names. They may have 3 or 4 word names. It works your memory. but just visually, it's really interesting to be in these environments. In rocky environments, we'll be in areas where that might have a sandy bottom. We'll get things like rays and a variety of different wildlife. We saw the little tortoises on land. We'll also have a chance to see sea turtles, like this green sea turtle. And I'm not sure if my video will work here. You can see that. I had a chance to follow this this green sea turtle at a respectful distance. I hardly had to do anything. I just had to kick a little bit with my flippers just to keep sort of following it, but very easy going. Beautiful experience. And if you do this, you'll be hooked, I'm convinced. You can snorkel with sea turtles. You may even be able to snorkel with the Galapagos penguin, which is the northernmost ranging penguin in the world. It's the only penguin whose range crosses into the northern hemisphere because it's crossing the equator in the Galapagos. And I had a chance, I took this photo when I was snorkeling with 12 of these Galapagos penguins, which was pretty fantastic. And so the underwater experience is really nice, but the locations are really interesting, and you'll start to remember there'll be some association you'll form with the actual location where we were. One of the places we snorkel on one of our itineraries is this place, which is called Kicker Rock. Typically, we do a pre-breakfast excursion here, snorkeling. This is a giant volcanic, basically cinder cone that was split through erosion and just through the erosion by the sea, by the force of the sea. We actually go up to it. And this photo was taken with my underwater camera. You can see the horizons distorted because the camera was meant to take photos underwater. But we can actually snorkel right in between these two rocks. And you go in there. This is me looking up the cliff. There's actually seabirds nesting way up on top of that big rock, looking straight up with the droplets of water on my camera. And you can see this is obviously a steep face. Well, underwater, the face goes basically straight down like a cliff. And it's rock, and there's barnacles which are going there, and it just goes down, and you don't really see how far down it's going, but just below you, so this swirl of fish, and this is really motion blur as the water is sort of swelling here below me. And on these faces, the snorkeling is interesting because you'll see things like this chocolate chip sea star. One of our travelers on the trip I did on my second trip, after our trip, it was sort of just before Christmas, sent me a photograph of cookies inspired by this trip. She made cookies in the shape of sea stars and put chocolate chips on them because this sea star looks like it's wearing chocolate chips. That is really its name. So you get to see all these interesting forms. And who knows, in this case, how deep that cliff goes. This was our guide, our Galapagos National Park guide, Juan, who went down with the camera, with someone else's camera to take a photo of what was below. He went all the way down, and he came up and said, Justin, there's sharks down there. And I thought, okay, well, I want to go down and see them. So I dove down, and he said they were resting. So I went down and as far as I could go, and then I didn't even see a bottom, but I saw this shark sort of vaguely swimming towards me, not directly at me, but kind of closer to me. And I stopped in my tracks. I took a photo, and I promptly returned to the surface. It's nothing that's dangerous, but you may have a chance to swim with sharks. On my last trip, I snorkeled with hammerhead sharks, which were maybe 20 feet below me. It wouldn't even have made a good photograph, but it was pretty amazing to see them sort of snaking along this way and seeing their nice hammerhead, and a pretty fantastic experience. So you have, five or six chances to snorkel. If you're new, try it as early as you can, and you'll be hooked, and then you'll be looking forward to every subsequent snorkeling expedition. Now, another element that isn't maybe one that you think of right away when you think of the Galapagos, but you'll come to be fairly important, is the volcanic history of the Galapagos. The islands are of volcanic origin. It's not always obvious though, but there are some places, some landings will do that are places that look like this, where there's no real apparent vegetation, like some of the places I've already shown you here that are bare rock, where it's obvious. It's obvious, like, hey, this is lava. This is obviously it's not flowing, but this is volcanic rock. This was lava that's flowing. And the shapes are amazing. And you start to see, if you kind of go back to the itinerary, once you've had it, to see that there was a bit of a rhyme and reason to those itineraries. Once you learn a little bit about how the Galapagos were formed, and just to show you here, we're all aware, I think, of tectonic plates, the fact that there are pieces of crust of the Earth that are sitting on the Earth and that are moving. And the Galapagos, which are down here, are sitting on the Nazca plate, which is moving southeast, and this is South America here on the right, and it's actually moving under or into South America, away from this sort of spreading zone here, this kind of line here. You see the Pacific plate moving to the west. So you have these different plates moving away from each other. The Galapagos are actually moving to the east, but there's not really an edge of a zone where you have plates colliding, which is normally where mountains form, where you expect volcanic activity. But there's something happening underneath the crust in that area, which not obvious, but there's something called a hot spot, basically an area of hotter volcanic material, which is coming from the core of the Earth, coming through the mantle here and erupting at the surface, as you can see here, as move from left to right. Now, the plate is here, that hot spot is below, is stationary here, and material is coming up to the surface, but the plate is moving over here this way. And as that plate continues to move, and as that activity continues to happen of molten material coming to the surface, you'll get these different volcanoes forming, which make different islands. And so the Galapagos are moving east, and originally the Galapagos might have been one single island. And as that plate moves east into South America, forming the Andes, volcanoes become extinct. Islands that were once volcanoes start wearing down. They become colonized by vegetation, and they wear down and become flatter and flatter. And so you'll see when you look at the map of the Galapagos, really the newer islands are to the west, that are highest, that have, in fact, may have some active volcanoes, the westmost part, but the older ones are to the right. And so we'll have a chance to visit some of the areas of newer activity, such as these lava fields here, which are not too much more than 100 years old, and they're safe to walk on. There's no actual activity going on right now, but you'll see different kinds of lava, which you might not even have imagined. There could be different kinds of lava, but you learn about it, like pillow lava, which is where lava was underwater, forming these pillow-like shapes. And you have lava, which is flowing on the surface, which forms these ripples, which are like rope. And they're called pahoehoe lava, which is a type of, which is a Hawaiian word to mean rope-like. And just different shapes and really wonderful, and different ages of lava. Older lava, volcanic rock becomes oxidized, kind of turns rusty and brown, and the newer one is still black. So it's breaking up and eventually being colonized by things like, appropriately enough, a lava cactus. It is a cactus endemic to the Galapagos, only found there, which is a specialist in these kind of new lava fields, which have nothing else. It'll somehow get into a crevice and grow there. So you'll find this different plant life adapted to different stages of evolution of the island itself. So very interesting from that perspective. And as you'll see on our circuit, as you kind of are observing the landscapes, you get a sense of, okay, this is an older island, there's a lot more vegetation, it's a lot lower, and the new islands are kind of bare, and they tend to be more barren or have more barren areas. So it all makes it interesting. Now, what I love about any experience in the wild is just that there will be certain things we plan for and other things that will just sort of spontaneously happen. And kind of the combination of all these factors, the Galapagos being remote, we have a kind of that sense of wilderness, but also the fact that the wildlife is not really afraid of people, lets us see things lets us make real novel observations of behavior. And I'll just share with you this really bizarre encounter we had on my first visit to the Galapagos of these birds here. These are called Nazca boobies, and they are endemic to the Galapagos, only found here. And we had a pair here, male and female, who were courting. Now, Nazca boobies are funny that their courting involves sort of honking and hissing at each other, bills striking. Well, they'll strike each other's bills. They'll kind of sing to each other, duetting to each other, and they'll wander around. They are known to be aggressive birds. They just naturally are offensive to other birds and to each other. And we were there on this beach, and we watched a pair. On the right here, you see a bird here and a bird here. These are swallow-tailed gulls, which are a species of gull, very bizarre looking bird, a nocturnal gull species. And they were nesting. A female gull was sitting on her egg. She was just sitting there incubating, not bothering anyone. And these Nazca boobies on the left were courting and making a fuss, and they happened to walk into the nest of the swallow-tailed gulls, which led to a bit of an altercation where the boobies harassed the gull off of her egg. And in fact, I have a bit of video here, and you'll see what happened. So it seems like they don't know what they did or what they were doing, and they kind of have forgotten about why they did that. Here goes the booby to play with the egg of the swallowtail gull. It's sort of handling it. And I thought maybe they're jealous, you know, they're courting, but they don't have their own eggs yet. So maybe they see this other species on her egg, and they're somehow in a kind of a flurry of emotion, I'm not sure, just displacing that gull. And they forgot about it, and then a couple of later, nothing happened. And, you know, it's like, who am I? What's my name? And, you know, one of the boobies picks up a leaf, and then they disappear. We go for a walk and complete our loop and come back, you know, half an hour later, 45 minutes later, and then the gull is back on her egg. So she didn't abandon her egg. Why did this happen? We don't know. But this is the type of stuff that happens on all of our, in fact, it happens on all of our Quest Nature tours, but the Galapagos really offer you that chance to see things really up close and to really, it's almost like a living laboratory of wildlife. So that's really a taster of some of the wildlife, some of the things we're looking for, a bit of the experience of being in the Galapagos. You might ask when to go to the Galapagos. Now, if you follow our newsletter, you might have read my blog recently about detailing this. But I'll talk just a little bit about this. You know, we have expeditions that go to the Galapagos generally in February and in October, straddling November. So really at 2 times a year. And they are different. They are different seasons. The first part of the year, let's say February is during the what we call the hot and rainy season, when skies tend to be clearer, the winds are lesser. There is more condensation forming above the islands, and that's when it rains. And when it rains, it doesn't mean it's raining all the time. It just means that during the day, heat will build up, and then eventually, you know, the clouds form over the islands, and then rain will fall. And most of the rain in the Galapagos happens during that time, and that transforms environments along the coast, which are fairly, you know, scrubby looking. You know, they can go from this, which is what they look like in October, November. The rains can make them look like this. Everything is fresh, deciduous trees that drop their leaves in the dry season, grow them back. Basically from January to April, things look kind of green and lush. And, you know, it's the time when birds like the different Darwin's finches are breeding. And so things are a little bit more active in that sense. Now, either season really is good to visit the Galapagos. I mean, the dry season is good in that in the lowlands, vegetation is sort of barren. It actually allows you to see through the vegetation better. If you wanted to, for example, see this species, which is the Galapagos rice rat. If you're really keen on endemic mammals, rare mammals, you might like to see this. It's easier to see in November because you can see this through the vegetation. This rat is only found in the Galapagos. It has evolved there especially. And November, sort of the late part of the year, October, November, it's in the cool and dry season, as it's called, or cool and cloudy season, as it's also called. And it rains very little in the lowlands, if at all. There might be a bit of mist in the morning. Generally, it's cloudy during most of the day, and then it clears up in the afternoon. And it can look dry, but it's also very gloomy and moody and very beautiful in its own interesting way. So landscapes can look like this, and I find them very appealing as well. So landscapes can look different. It's just something to be aware of. Generally October, November, it feels pleasant to be outside all day long. Whereas in February, it can feel hot during midday, but we're not on land in kind of at midday in February anyways. At any time of year, we spend the midday usually on our vessel or we're snorkeling. So timing of year can be important also for certain species. For example, the waved albatross, which is an endemic or near endemic bird. Actually, it is endemic. It's only found breeding in the Galapagos. And you wouldn't see these birds in February because the wind conditions aren't right for them. They need good wind, consistent wind to be flying because they don't like to flap us very much. And so if you went on October, November, you could see them at that time. The seasons also, there are also differences in water temperature from one season to the next. If you go in October, November, the water is definitely cool and you need to wear a wetsuit when you're snorkeling. We have wetsuits available. That's not really an issue, and they're very comfortable and allow you to be out there. You don't need a full-length wetsuit. Just the core of your body is enough to keep you warm. But the snorkeling experience being what it is, being, I think, a great part of this, of any Galapagos visit, it's something you want to take advantage of. Now, if you go in February, the water is generally warm enough to go without a wetsuit. In this case, you could just go in your normal swimming trunks. And of course, we recommend always going with a shirt because the sun, the equatorial sun, is very strong and you can get sunburned very quickly, even underwater. So you wear a shirt just to keep yourself protected from sun, but you don't need a wetsuit, and the water is generally just fine to be in. So that's just a taster. I'll send you a link to my blog in case you haven't seen it, just so you can read a little bit more detail about the seasons. But just for you to be aware of that. Now, we do have different itineraries. We have 2 different itineraries that we use, and typically we kind of go based on the time of year. So in February, generally we're using this itinerary here, which is the Eastern itinerary. You're getting a variety of islands with a variety of wildlife. The islands are of different ages. You get kind of older islands and newer, younger islands. So you're getting variety in all sorts of different ways. And so this is the route we would use for that. And just to show you, it's roughly corresponding. Oh, that's this is the one I showed you with that circle at the beginning of the presentation. The Western itinerary would be this here with the red circle, which is kind of on this side here, whereas the Eastern was kind of covering this over here. And so we're over here in the West I'm sorry, let me back up here for a second. I got myself mixed up. The Eastern itinerary we're using in October, November, and the Western currently we're doing this one in February. So, and that looks a little bit like this. So once again, we're getting exposure to a variety of different environments and different wildlife as well. If you're very, very keen on seeing the next bird, which is the flightless cormorant, it is only found in the western part of the archipelago. So you would have to go on the Western itinerary in order to see this bird. If you're not so focused on this bird, then East or West, I think you'll find them both enjoyable and interesting. So I would say any trip to the Galapagos is really an extraordinary experience. And just in that 1 week, I mean, that 1 week goes very quickly. We have a very dense experience. You don't have that much time on the vessel when you're not, I mean, you're on the vessel and you sleep very well because it's such a really a full day with everything going on. Wonderful vessel. It's a wonderful way to experience the islands, and there's also something very interesting in terms of the wildlife. I mean, I think intellectually you'll find this a fantastic trip, just visually, and it's a very sensual trip. in terms of the landscapes and wildlife you're seeing. And we do have a couple of expeditions planned for 2021. Of course, we don't yet quite have all the details on whether we can go freely to the Galapagos. But I'll tell you that we have two sets of dates that are planned for 2021. I'm planning to host our expedition in February, which is the Western itinerary. And then in October, we have Catherine Jardine, who will be leading our trip in the Eastern itinerary. And so right now we have, of course, a special booking offer where you can put down $50 only and pay the balance of your deposit, which would be $450 when the travel restrictions to Ecuador are lifted. We don't know when that will be yet, but you can hold your spot right now if you like, with only $50 down. So now, while you're in South America, while you're in Ecuador, I'll just talk very briefly. Many of our travelers like to visit Machu Picchu in neighboring Peru. So if you haven't been to Machu Picchu, it's a great opportunity to do an extension there. We have a planned extension. So if you're interested in this, just ask us. I mean, we can give you the itinerary for, in fact, you can download the Galapagos itinerary yourself from our website, from the different tour web pages, but we can send you an itinerary for Machu Picchu. We also have extensions if you're interested particularly in the bird life in mainland Ecuador, which is extraordinary. Ecuador has one of the greatest diversities in terms of numbers of bird species of any country in the world. It's a mega diverse country. And so we have an extension that visits the cloud forest area of Ecuador to take in some of that particularly bird life, and visiting some special lodges. And I mean, just the hummingbirds alone in the cloud forest of mainland Ecuador are incredible. These are booted racket tail. They have wonderful names. Look at their little boots, their white boots, and the racket tails. Now, it so happens that in October, November of 2021, out of our different extensions, because we also had an extension that visited the Amazon rainforest of Eastern Ecuador, from our different extensions, we've actually created a new tour, which is what we're calling the Complete Ecuador, which immediately follows our October Galapagos expedition. It includes the cloud forest of Ecuador, and it also includes the Amazon rainforest. So we go to a special lodge in the lowlands of Eastern Ecuador, where we spend a few days, and you might have seen images like this of these macaws feeding at a clay lick site. This is one of the experiences we feature on that Complete Ecuador land tour. So I'll send you information to that as well if you want to consider that for October, November of next year. So much to consider here. I hope you've had a chance just to, I hope you've had a good first taste of the Galapagos, or a revisit if you've been there before. I cannot I cannot say enough about the Galapagos and how much of a life-changing experience that I think it is for all of our travelers. And so in closing, I'm going to share with you some of my favorite images from the Galapagos that'll give you a little bit of a sense and maybe inspire you to consider going to the Galapagos or going back there. And then we'll open it up to questions. Great. So thank you everyone so much for joining me on this presentation on the Galapagos Islands. I hope you enjoyed it. And if there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. I'll just take a look here to see if we have any. And I'll just wait a minute here if anyone of you wants to type in any questions here. As I mentioned, we will be sending out a link to the recording of this presentation, as well as some of the additional information. I do have one question here: is do the seas get rough? I would say they can get rough. If they would be rougher, it'll tend to be later on in the year. So for the kind of the cool and dry season, when winds tend to consistently be higher than they are from January to April. Personally, I've not experienced anything that's rough. I know that on occasion there have been maybe, there's been like a half day where the seas are rougher and there's a bit of pitch on the vessel, but that's not something that's not a consistent thing. I mean, the seas can be rough at any time. So we do generally recommend, I know a lot of our seafaring travelers will get the patch that you wear behind your ear, or other, I'm not sure if gravel is really the best thing, but I think the patch that you wear behind your ear is a good thing to start in advance before you get on the vessel to stave off motion sickness. So there's a potential there, but it has never been a thing where it's a multi-day experience where every single day is rough. That's just not something. That's not our experience of the seas there. So it's just best to be prepared.
See the question about the research team?
Okay.
Research teams who remain on the islands for conservation.
I'm trying to see. Oh, let me see if I can see all the questions. I see a couple of them here. Okay. Oh, I have quite a few questions here. So one of the questions: are there any research teams who remain on the islands for conservation or documentation of wildlife? There are regular surveys that the Galapagos National Park Service does in certain places to monitor recovery of reintroduced wildlife, or to also monitor introduced wildlife. There have been, of course, over the years in the 19th century, actually since before the 19th century, introduced species like goats and pigs and such. There have been efforts to remove introduced wildlife, so there's monitoring to see what are the impacts of those removals, the recovery, to look at the recovery of the natural vegetation, which often has been pretty well impacted. So the regular surveys also of tortoises, of the different bird life. There are certain research teams which come out, which are conducting actual studies on the islands at any one time. One of our leaders, in fact, Glenn Barrett, he actually spent 6 months as part of a research team, I believe, on the island of Hispaniola, where those albatross nest. So there's a lot of research going on. I would say it isn't obvious when you're visiting. As a visitor, we don't encounter any of those research projects in action. But any of our observations that we make can also, if they're significant, if, for example, we notice anything that doesn't seem right. For example, on my first trip, we noticed cat footprints, domestic cat footprints on one of the beaches. Cats are introduced to the islands. Knowing that something was seen, that we have fresh tracks, we would report that to the Galapagos National Park Service. So everything is really in the background in terms of us visiting. Now we do visit the Charles Darwin Research Station, which is kind of a hub of research, almost the nerve center for research that's going on in the Galapagos. You have a bit of a chance to gain some insight on different research activities when we're on the islands. Another question here. How do the boobies get their name? Well, we have 3 different species of boobies that are in the Galapagos: blue-footed booby, red-footed booby, and the Nazca booby. Booby, I believe it comes from bobo in Spanish, which means kind of dummy or not too smart, not too bright. And that's because the birds, when you see them, I think you can maybe kind of understand sympathetically. Of course, they don't always seem very smart. They're smart in their own way, but I believe that's where the word comes from. I had a question: if you add Ecuador birding, how long would the whole trip be? Well, So the Galapagos trip itself, I said it's about a week on the vessel itself, but with arrival and departure, it's really, I think 10 days, so about 10 days. With the extensions, if you did Ecuador birding, if I recall correctly, that's basically 6 days you're adding. You could do that as a pre-trip extension or a post-trip extension. There's also the Amazon Lodge extension, which is about 5 days. So you could add from 5 to 10 days. If you were to do our October Galapagos trip, you could simply add that entire Ecuador tour, which is actually 14 days when you put it all together. So it's really as long as you want. If you have a short time, then you want to do just an extension. If you have a longer time, you can do a whole land trip in Ecuador. I have a question as well. In what year was it proclaimed that visitors should be restricted to a time arrival and departure regulation? I was talking about how our visits are regulated in terms of our landings, how long we have on land, and when we arrive and when we have to leave. I believe the new restrictions, tighter restrictions, came into effect in 2012. Question, what is the number of people per tour? Great question. Well, our tour is typically 12 to 15 travelers per tour. Plus you'll have your quest leader joining you. So 12 to 15 is a typical number. Linda is asking, why do we have 2 different itineraries? To be very honest, is to keep it interesting. We could visit, one or the other itinerary. We could stick to one itinerary for both times of year. That would be, there's no real issue or problem with that. But it's just a chance for us to visit the 2 different sides. There are, as I said, the albatross is only something you see in October, November, so you have to do the Eastern itinerary to see that. You're getting really a fantastic experience either way. It's the length that we're using really just makes it possible to get that greatest amount of variety as well. So it's just variety is the spice of life, and that's why we have the 2 different itineraries. Will we see any of the finches of the big bird lineage as mentioned in the October 3rd Economist article? Ian is asking that question. I'm not sure. I did not see that October 3rd Economist article. I'm assuming you're referring to the Darwin's finches, and because you're talking about finches here, we have a chance to see several species of the Darwin's finches. We cannot see all of them. Some of them are range restricted, some of them are altitude restricted. So we never see all of them, but we'll see a very good assortment of them as we go from the different islands, on the different islands. And let's see, another question here. Is scuba diving prohibited in order to protect the environment and fish life? Well, scuba diving is permitted in the Galapagos Island at designated scuba sites. We are not going to scuba sites. We are going to sites where we're allowed to snorkel. Scuba sites, there are some of them that are quite remote, but they are regulated in the same sense that our landings are regulated. Scuba sites are also regulated. So you cannot just sort of anyone go to the scuba site and go scuba diving. There is a certain protocol that has to be followed with respect to not disturbing the wildlife. The Galapagos, of course, are an important part in the migration of various fish, including hammerhead sharks, between the Galapagos and almost Costa Rica, sort of the offshore waters of Costa Rica. So the Galapagos are fairly intimately linked or interlinked with other parts of the world in terms of the marine environment. So those are also the impact of humans on marine life in the Galapagos is regulated. And let's see if there's any other ones that I could answer here. I believe that I've answered most of these questions here. If you have any other questions, of course, I'd welcome you to write to me at the address here on your screen, justin@worldwidequest.com. As I said, we'll be sending you the recording. If you have any other questions about the Galapagos or anything else, such as just travel in general in 2021, I welcome you to contact me. And of course, I do hope that you've seen our new digital catalog, which is on our website. And you can have a look at this tour and any of our other tours coming up. So without further ado, I want to thank you very much all for joining me on this short discovery of the Galapagos. I do hope that you'll join us in the future, and I wish you a good afternoon. Thank you very much.